So I suggest we get started. Welcome everyone to the second season of the GGP-connect webinar, Insights and Impact, where we invite GGP national teams to showcase how they have presented their data to various audiences like policymakers, funders, or the public to create attention and impact. My name is Olga Grünwald and I'm the data manager at GGP, and Aisling Connolly from the GGP Central Hub is also joining me behind the scenes. And I'm also very excited to welcome our speakers, Aart Liefbroer and Lonneke van der Berg from NIDI. And they'll be sharing insights from their work with the GGS in the Netherlands and the impact that they aim to achieve with the GGS. Before we get started, a couple of quick housekeeping things. So this webinar is being recorded and you can find it back on the GGP website. And if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to put them in the Q&A box. And if you like to ask your question directly, then we will have a Q&A session after the presentation where you can do that. And that's all from me, and I give the floor to Aart and Lonneke.
Thank you very much, Olga, for your kind introduction. This is going to be a joint presentation by the two of us. I'll kick off with part one, so to say, and then Lonneke will take over and do part two. But before doing so, I'm going to share our PowerPoint. So I think you're now seeing the PowerPoint. The title is Showcasing the GGS Experience from the Netherlands. And as I said before, we have two parts. In the first part, we will reflect a little bit on what we mean by creating impact. This is a webinar on insights and impact, but what are the different ways in which we can try to create impact with the GGP, and how do we try to do so in the Netherlands? And then Lonneke will take over for part two, which is the exciting substantive part, where we talk about an example of research we're doing and how we try to communicate this to a broader audience. Okay, first impact, but let me first remind you about what the Dutch GGS is. The data collection for wave one of the Generations and Gender Survey in the Netherlands was done between November 2022 and November 2023. In the Netherlands, we used a web questionnaire, and we didn't go for a mixed mode approach simply because interviewing respondents was by far too expensive in this country. So we opted for a pure web-based questionnaire. We have a random sample of the Dutch population, aged between 18 and 59. And we didn't go until age 79 because in the Netherlands we also have the share survey. So we could only get funding for the age bracket 18 to 59. The response rate was 30.2%, which we felt in the end was pretty okay for a web survey. And the total number of respondents that you can find in the data set is 8,078. The data have been released in June. There's a report coming out very soon with all the details of data collection in the Netherlands, where we also tell you about how we did things, how we got to this response rate of 30.2%, and how selective our sample was. So that's the data that we work with in the Netherlands. If we talk about impact, very often we think, if you hear the word impact, you think about policy impact. And that's important. But to us, there are a number of different aspects to impact. The first one is simply science. The GGP is a research infrastructure that is used that is meant to keep Europe at the forefront of the scientific developments in the social sciences. So the first way in which we try to create impact is by using GGP in our scientific research. Then the second aspect of impact is education. You can use the GGP as a tool in teaching courses at different levels. A third way is what we call public debate. And that's using the GGP to inform the general public about societal changes and societal developments. And then fourth, you have the element of policy and policy impact, the use of the GGP to inform policy debates and decisions. And I'm going to give you some examples of all four types of impact that we try to create. Let's start with the science. Of course, how do scientists try to create scientific impact? That is by publishing your results in all kinds of outlets, but very often in peer-reviewed scientific articles. And what we're doing in the Netherlands is no exception to that rule. But the kind of science we do, of course, very often is informed and results from important scientific debates in society. So, for instance, what we try to do is to look also in the scientific way at, okay, what can we learn from the GGP in understanding of vulnerable groups? And I think there's a lot that we can learn from that, about that from the GGP. Just a very brief example, take the topic of singlehood. The number of singles and the proportion of singles is rising, and it's this group that seems to be particularly vulnerable on the housing market. And to examine this, I've been looking into the extent to which people with different types of singlehood histories differ in their likelihood of being a homeowner. So what did I do? I took data from 11 European countries, and I took people between the ages of 45 and 49. And then I looked at the extent to which they experienced periods of living without a partner between the ages of 30 and 45. So the key family formation period in the life of many people. And here is the overall picture. The blue bar is the group of people who lived with a partner throughout the period of 30 to 45. And you see that among this group, about 90% was a homeowner when they were between 45 and 49. Then you have people who simply start late with living with a partner. This is the orange bar called pre-partner singles. So these were people who only started living with a partner after they're 30, after the age of 30. Those postponers of family formation, about 80% were homeowners between ages 45 and 49. Then you have people who separate but start a new relationship. These are the people in the gray bar, the friction singles. Just slightly over 70% is a homeowner. So the yellow bar, that's the group of post-partner singles, those who were partnered but separated between 30 and 45 and did not re-partner. 60% of them are homeowners when they are between 45 and 49. And then the final bar, which is greenish, that's the people who are permanently single between 30 and 45. And it's just 55% of them being homeowners. So you see a very clear gradient suggesting that episodes of singlehood reduce the chance of people to become a homeowner. And of course, this is a general picture in Europe. If you look at different countries, the picture looks different per country, but the general trend is visible in most countries. And what is particularly interesting for the Dutch case is here you have the Netherlands, that here this gradient, this single hood trajectory gradient, is largest of all countries in Europe. So particularly in the Netherlands, those who are single, and particularly those who are permanently single or single because they had a partner relationship but did not repartner, then you have a dramatically reduced chance of being a homeowner. So that's an example of how we try to link our scientific work with societally relevant questions. The second kind of impact we try to create is through education. And this is particularly the use of GGP in teaching. And an example is family sociology at the University of Utrecht. They are using the GGP and particularly now the new special teaching data set that has been created in their teaching efforts, and students have to use this data set to do some practical work themselves. The third way of impact we try to create is in the public debate. And again, here it's about using the GGP to fuel our understanding of societal issues. And one way we do this is, for instance, by the fact that we're currently preparing a special issue of Demos. And Demos is a Dutch magazine that tries to create awareness about population-related issues. And here you see the cover of the English language demos that was used at the European Population Conference. Usually it's in Dutch. And we're preparing a special issue where we provide information drawn from the GGS on singlehood, on housing and fertility, and on temporary contracts and well-being. So this is just to say, if you think about public debate, it is broader than just policy. And then finally, policy impact. And we see policy impact particularly as informing debates and decisions. We're not gonna tell policymakers what to do. They probably don't want, they don't need that. But even if they need that, we're informing them about we're giving them relevant information, but they have to decide whether and if so, how to use it. What we did, for instance, was that we had a policy brief where we invited people from ministries, other societal stakeholders, and where we told them about the GGS and provided them with a number of examples. And this was really well received. And for instance, now the Dutch Science Foundation, when they talk about the importance of research infrastructures in the Netherlands, they specifically mention the GGP and this kind of things that we're doing. And the other thing is that we used the GGS data in a long-running project here at NIDI on policy responses to population trends, which is funded by the Dutch government. And again, it's a way of informing policy debates and decisions by raising awareness. For instance, trying to answer the question, who experiences housing problems when they want to start living with a partner? Which groups are most vulnerable in that sense? But another really nice way of using the GGS is in terms of benchmarking. How does the Netherlands do compared to other European countries? For instance, if you think about the topic, how satisfied are people with housing in the Netherlands? And then if you can compare that with other European countries, this tells you, and this can be really informative for policymakers. So these are some tiny examples of the way in which we try to use the GGS in the Dutch context to create impact. Okay, this is the kind of overall introduction of why we're doing this. Let's now move to an example of with real societal interest. So I move around and give the floor to Lonneke.
Hi. Yeah, I'm happy to tell you more about the research I did with the new GGP data. And I looked at temporary contracts and young people's well-being and life course uncertainty. And this topic relates actually to three societal issues. First of all, nowadays we see that young people are not doing as well as previously. The well-being of young people has declined quite a lot in recent years. For example, if we look at the question, how happy are you with your life? We saw with register data that whereas 1 in 10 young people was unhappy in 2000 in the Netherlands, this is now 1 in 5. So it doubled in 20 years. And this is a trend that's not only related to the COVID crisis, we also see it now. It has not improved since. And we see it in different countries and also in different areas of well-being. So also, if we look at mental health problems, for example, we see a rise in mental health problems among young people. Next to this issue, in recent years, the road to adulthood, so to say, as we demographers study, has become increasingly difficult. I think this time cover illustrates it quite nicely by saying growing up is harder than ever. And we see this in different areas of the young adult life course. For example, we see that it's takes young people longer before they leave the parental home, and also other steps are being prolonged or they don't make these steps at all. And finally, a societal issue here in the Netherlands and also, especially in the Netherlands, is that there's a high number of temporary contracts among young people. This is really specific to the young adult group. So it's about 30% among those 25 to 29 years old. And this I studied with the GGS data, and it can quite nicely show how this is really a problem of the young generation. And it also makes it possible to compare across countries. And this makes clear that this is especially a problem in the Netherlands. I focused here on 18 to 35-year-olds employees. And you see that in the Netherlands, it's a lot higher than in most other European countries. And these temporary contracts might be problematic because they are related to these other two topics. There are worries in the public debate about the toll these temporary contracts take, if they add to stress, if they make it more difficult to settle down and get a stable life. And that's what inspired this research to look at, do these three elements actually interact? Is there a relation between these three different topics? So to what extent do we see that having a temporary contract relates to young people's well-being and their life course uncertainty? So do we see that they face more stress or worries about whether they can make certain steps. I looked at this with data for 18 to 35-year-olds, so the young people, and I controlled in all models for age and gender, because as we've seen, especially early in the young adult life course, people have temporary contracts, so I accounted for age, and I used the new data of the GGS. And first of all, I did a comparison across countries. To what extent do we see that young people who have a temporary contract are more unhappy or more likely to be unhappy? I coded this as giving life a 6 or lower. And we see that actually in most European countries, there is not much of a relationship between having a temporary contract and satisfaction with life or happiness. But the Netherlands is an exception here, where we do see a big difference. For young people with a permanent contract, about 11% is unhappy. But for those with a temporary contract, this is 19%, so almost double. And the only other countries where we see a difference is Germany and United Kingdom. So and those differences, as you can see, are a bit smaller. So in the rest of the presentation, I looked more into the Netherlands specifically, also to relate it to the public debates here. And first of all, I looked at the specific questions in the GGP about how people feel during the week. So the question was felt often or most of the time. How often in the week do you feel a certain way? And this makes clear that in all these aspects that represent negative feelings, we see that people with a temporary contract score lower. And particularly, this was a big difference in couldn't shake off the blues. That's way more common among those with a temporary contract, and also feeling like life was a failure. And yeah, it was actually over the whole realm. You see quite big differences. Next, to look at which groups are especially vulnerable to this, we looked specifically at education levels. The idea here is also that people who have a higher education level might be less uncertain about the future, might have better temporary jobs, might have been in a better position, and therefore are not so vulnerable to negative feelings related to having a temporary contract. And we see that this is indeed the case, especially among lower educated. There are big differences in how in the between type of contracts in these feelings. An example of this is couldn't shake off the blues. This was only the case for 5% of those with a permanent contract, both among lower and higher educated. But among those with a temporary contract, we see a big difference with lower educated almost having this feeling. 15% of them had this feeling, while among the higher educated, the difference was quite small. And also here you see that the being fearful and sad that those differences are not so vulnerable is so different for the education levels, but depression and feeling like life was a failure has bigger differences. And then finally, I wanted to understand how can we explain these differences? Why are there these differences in the happiness of people with a temporary and a permanent contract? And to do so, I wanted to capture this uncertainty feeling. And this is very nice. A nice element of the GGP is that they looked at also how people see certain things in the future. They asked all people, regardless of whether they want a child, if they think they would fulfill certain conditions that would allow them to have a child. And I focus here on financially being able to afford a child, having access to suitable housing, and feeling ready to have another child or a child. And I think these capture quite nicely to what extent they expect in 3 years to be in a situation where they are financially stable, personally stable, and stable in the sense of housing. And here we see big differences, especially in regarding housing. So this also relates a bit to what Aart presented before. The housing is a hot topic in the Netherlands because it's difficult to find suitable housing. And you see that this also relates to the type of contract. So especially young people who have a temporary contract don't expect to be in a situation in 3 years where they can have a child, whereas this is less the case for people with a permanent contract. And the financial differences are actually a lot less than the housing aspect. So it's really about being able to make these steps. And here you can imagine that having a temporary contract could make it more difficult to get a mortgage. So this might explain why we see this difference. So to sum up why this data and this research could be very relevant for understanding societal issues, first of all, it's very nice to be able to compare across countries. And this made clear that in the Netherlands, there is this high prevalence of temporary contracts. So that puts in perspective compared to other European countries that this is really something that might be more of a problem in the Netherlands. And we see these big differences in well-being. So this also makes clear that there might be possibilities, for example, for policy to address this. We cannot, or I did not test what could be done, but you could imagine with the as we see that housing plays a role, that also here in the area of housing, there might be policies that could help decrease these differences. Next to that, it shows that it's nice that with this data you can identify these vulnerable groups. And the research shows that especially these young people who are lower educated are vulnerable when they are in a temporary contract. So it helps to know which groups are struggling and which are struggling less. And finally, it has this nice information about life course uncertainty, or about the future, about the planning of life course that you don't often find in surveys. And I think this is really a good way to also explore some of these explanations for these big differences. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Aart and Lonneke, for the presentation. It was really nice and interesting to hear about your plans and also get some first insights into the data. So as a reminder, if you have a question, you can put it in the Q&A box, or if you want to ask directly, you can unmute yourself, raise your hand first, unmute yourself, and then ask it directly. All right. While people are getting ready to ask the question, I'd like to ask a more general one. So I recently came around the term that was in the scope of citizen science, is that nothing without us, nothing about us without us. And Aart, you presented the different types of impact that you can have to the different stakeholders. And I was wondering, to what extent do you also plan to incorporate not only to send information, but also to receive back some information from the different stakeholders to further work on the impact of the data?
Well, thank you. Well, of course, citizen science is in, like you said, a hot topic at the moment. I think right now we don't have very clear plans yet. And this may have to do a little bit with the kind of structure that we have with the GGP. Because in the Netherlands, what we do basically is we send people the questionnaire as it has been conceived by the international GGP leadership. So it's not that we add questions, it's just the questionnaire. So at least in that part, there's little room for citizen science. Of course, there could be room in the sense that we could try to use the GGS data to answer questions that citizens have and that they may not be able to answer for themselves simply because they don't have the kind of data skills that are needed to get this out of the data. This is something we haven't done yet, but which we could certainly look at. This special issue of Demos that I told you about earlier, we will also send this special issue to the participants in the GGS. And we will certainly ask them that if they have any reactions or if they have questions, that it would be great to get feedback from them. So maybe we can get some of this interaction going in that way.
Thank you very much. And we already have a first question from Gosta Esping Andersen.
Yeah, hello again, Aart. Thank you for that presentation on temporary contracts. That was interesting. I could mention sort of on the sidelines that I'm doing a fertility survey study, comparative, and I'm also controlling for temporary contracts, and it has no effect, nowhere. But this brings me to the Netherlands and the GGS for Netherlands, because what I'm looking at is the sudden drop in fertility in Western countries in the decade 2010 to 2020. My window of analysis is 2000 to 2020. And I had thought for my event history analysis comparisons to also include the Dutch GGS survey. Then I saw the very low response rate, and that made me nervous. What I want to ask you about, and maybe it's more Aart that is the person to answer this question, is have you done any testing of underlying selection into response, non-response, given that very low response rate? Because what I was afraid of is I would be working with a huge amount of selection problems with bias.
So for my research, I did some comparisons with register data. So for example, the percentage of temporary contracts, and those were quite comparable. So that's, yeah, there we don't have information about life satisfaction, but yeah, they were rather comparable. Yeah, and of course, by including the major controls like gender or age, yeah, that helps. I don't know about the response rate.
Yeah, shall I add a little bit? Of course, 30% is just 30%. So 70% is non-response. Unfortunately, this is very common, not just in the Netherlands, but particularly also in the Netherlands, but in very many other countries. And I think for a web survey, we didn't do that bad. If you talk about selection, of course, there will be selection. The only thing we know is that, well, okay, we can check whether there's selection on things like gender, on age group, on living arrangement, on education. And there are differences between our sample and the population data that we have. And we try to conceive of weights that control for this. But to what extent there will be selection on all kind of aspects that are that you can't get from the register. Sure, there will be people, maybe there's an underrepresentation of people who don't have kids. Maybe there's an underrepresentation of people who have divorced and or are in poor relationships. That's simply something we don't know, and I don't really know any good way to get around it. But I personally, I would still think that these data are, well, at least the best we can get at the moment. And of course, survey data, they have the unique aspects that you have information on how people, on the subjective ideas of people about topics. And that is something that you would not get from registers if you would be using registers.
Well, my key issue is actually selection and education. For my analysis, the degree to which, especially the lower educated, are underrepresented. Do you have any testing of that?
Yeah, we did, and of course the lower educated are underrepresented. We try to control for this by weighting, but basically this is true for each and every kind of survey that you will get. Those with low education are less likely to answer the questionnaire than those with high levels of education. And if you know how to get around that problem, you're my man.
Shoot myself. No, it was just that I was just pouncing on that very low, the 30%, and knowing, I mean, we know that less educated are always underrepresented, but given 30% response, I thought, mamma mia, this is going to be very biased against representation of low skilled. And I saw the same thing in the British, the GGS-II. I had to simply throw out Britain out of my study because you didn't get any almost any low skilled people, and the same in Germany, because the response rates are too low. But you said you tested for education, right?
Yeah. We have a report on it, and I think it will be available on the GGP website before the end of the year, where we give information on the extent to which our data are selective and the ways in which we tried to control for it using the GGS developed weights.
But would you say I can use it now?
I would certainly advise you to do so.
Yes,
okay,
me too, from the central hub. Right. Thank you very much for your question. We also have a question in the chat from Julia Rokus from the GGP Central Hub. Aart, can you tell a bit more about your experience with the policy briefing, and would you say that it was a successful initiative?
Our experience with the policy briefing. You were there.
Yeah.
What was your experience?
Yeah, I think the people were quite engaged, so we managed to get people from different areas. So that was the group was not very big, but they did think along, and I think they really liked it. So they found it interesting, and I think also making this demos, for example, that we are doing, that could also be a nice follow-up to them.
I think that the interesting thing that is possible with the GGS is that you can link things that are happening in people's life course and that they feel very strongly about themselves to important societal issues, like the kind of employment contracts that you have, whether you are in what kind of housing you are, what kind of issues you're engaging in terms of well-being, and particularly these kind of interactions. That's something that policymakers don't often get so much insight from scientific research. So I think it worked really well, and we're certainly gonna do it again.
That's good to hear. Are there any more questions? And then I can ask one more, since I have the privilege to do so. Lonneke, you showed in one of your first graphs where you compared the temporary contract and the permanent contracts by country, country differences. And what struck me was that overall the Netherlands seemed quite low in terms of unhappiness. So how do you think is that linked to your findings, that you study that in the Netherlands, where the levels might still be quite low, which is obviously a good thing?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Yeah, I forgot to discuss that indeed. But if we look at the permanently employed people in the Netherlands, they are doing best of all groups that I looked at. And yeah, so I think that's also something to keep in mind, that it's something that we see more often, that in the Netherlands the life satisfaction is quite high comparative to other places. But especially with these permanently employed, high happiness might be also because the permanently employed are well protected in the Netherlands. So there are quite strict rules, which makes that they are in a very good position. So I think that's something to keep in mind, indeed, that if we change things, a smaller cap could also mean that their well-being goes down. So that's something to avoid. And I think important to keep in mind here is that the size of the group also differs. So we have more people in temporary employment in the Netherlands. So the people who are permanently employed might be slightly more specialized group that is doing well than in other countries where that's more common.
Great, thank you. Looking at the time and your last chance to ask one more question. All right, then I would suggest we finish with this, the official part of the webinar. Again, many thanks, Aart and Lonneke, for presenting on your experiences with the GGS in the Netherlands. If you want to stay online for a bit and chat, please do so.